What's up, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Aimbot, the weekly podcast where I discuss video games and video game hardware, what I like, dislike, and the general topics in the video game industry. I'm your host, Kaif Pape. Sometimes I'll be joined by guests, other times not. This week I'm solo, and I'll be discussing the recent new console generation launch and just what has been delivered to us so far. Later, I give my recommendations on how to prepare for next gen, or is it current gen, and let you know the games I'm currently playing and why. You can get the show on youtube.com/KaifPape and podcast services around the globe. I hope you had a great weekend. You should be listening to this on Monday, but this being the very first episode, it's probably out on a Tuesday. But let's get straight into it. Let's start out by discussing the elephant in the room, or not so much the elephant in the room when it comes down to next generation consoles, and that is the Xbox Series S. Not to be confused with the Xbox One S, or the Xbox One X shouldn't be confused with the Xbox Series X. I do not understand Microsoft's naming conventions. They're totally confusing, and I can only imagine how parents potentially buying new consoles for the kids, they might wind up with an Xbox One S, which is terrible. But that's another story. But let's just discuss the Xbox Series S and why I think it's a terrible idea. Why I think it will potentially hold back development on games, particularly for Microsoft exclusives. See, I just think that third-party developers will just not focus on it at all. They'll focus on the Series X or the PS5, and then they'll just cut back to accommodate the Series S. Now, why is the Series S so bad? Microsoft is marketing the Series S as being the same as the Series X, but just targeted for lower resolutions. So, according to them, the Series S is good if you do not own a 4K TV, you're not planning on owning a 4K TV anytime soon, and your main focus is either 1080p gaming or 1440p. And of course, if you own a 1080p set, the 1440p would be downsampled, and you'd still get a cleaner image than a native 1080p. Fine, but that is just not the case, right? The Xbox Series S is a 4 teraflop machine, and let me preface this by saying I know that teraflops don't mean everything. Teraflops are not the end-all, be-all of metrics in terms of judging a console, and we'll get into that a bit later when we discuss PS5 outperforming Series X. But it's still that having that vast of a difference between teraflops will translate in how games are made and how games are played. So the Series X, everyone knows, Microsoft touts it as being the quote-unquote most powerful console ever made, coming in at 12 teraflops. And based on just raw spec sheet, you can probably argue that it is. But in comparison, they've also made one of the worst consoles in recent time with the Series S, because that comes in at 4 teraflops. Mind you, the PS4 Pro was 4.2 teraflops, so it's even weaker than a PS4 Pro, and it's significantly weaker than in terms of raw teraflops, the Xbox One X, which was a 6 teraflop machine, and that is last gen. Or since everyone hasn't moved up just yet, that's still current gen. And these next gen consoles, there's no way a next gen console should be weaker than its last gen like previous entries. So, yes, I do know the GPU is way better. The CPU is miles better. So, yes, that's why teraflops aren't everything. But when it comes on to just hitting like raw display resolution to display whatever games you want, there are significant sacrifices that have to be made. So, a case in point is something like Dirt 5, which it has like a 120 FPS mode. I'm not even going to get into that, but it has a 120 FPS mode on all consoles, so Series X, PS5, and Series S. However, for the Series S to actually achieve this, it drops down to a ridiculous, 640p at times, even if you are gaming on a 1080p set and you have the best post processing like ever, that is still remarkably blurry. And people keep arguing that the 120 FPS is more important in like a driving game or a shooting game or a fighting game where you need quick response. But clear visibility is equally as important, if not better, because the jump from 60 to 120 is not as significant from like 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second, right? So I believe the game developers, like first and foremost, just need to drop this 120 FPS. It's good that the games can do it. And one example of it done really well was the latest Call of Duty Cold War on next-gen consoles. It's done really well on the Xbox One X and the PS5. But it's unnecessary, right? For starters, not many TVs can even currently display 120 FPS at 4K. So you need a HDMI 2.1 set to be able to accommodate that. And majority of persons, like less than 1% of persons, can do that, right? And it's the same thing with VRR, which is variable refresh rate. There's literally 40 televisions in the entire world, 40 sets that are HDMI compatible, HDMI 2.1 compatible, that support VRR and 120 at 4K, right? So I believe developers should just park 120 for now, maybe in games that are not as GPU intensive. Like there's no GPU bottleneck or CPU bottleneck, then fine, go ahead for 120, maybe some indie titles. That's fine. Having the option is there, but we still need to understand that these are consoles and we don't want console gaming to be too confusing as it can be when gaming on PC. So, having a performance mode and having a resolution mode, I think that's fine. So resolution mode or quality mode and performance mode is fine. 60 FPS, quality mode can even still be 60 FPS, but with certain things turned up, and like a native 4K as opposed to something that varies. Anyway, getting back to the Series S. Why is it a bad idea? You have to play at like freaking 640p to accommodate this 120 FPS. I'm just using Dirt 5 as an example. And you're getting this amazing input response, right? But what you're seeing is like a muddy mess. How can you be playing a driving game where you need to see exactly what's going on and you're just seeing soupy puddles? There's popping like crazy. It's just because the console is just too weak to facilitate a true next-gen experience, right? And these games that are coming out now, especially on the Microsoft platforms, every single one of these games are cross-platform, right? Xbox does not have any next-gen exclusives. that are like only available on these new consoles. So everything that you're getting now, you're able to get on the Xbox One X, and you're having cases of Xbox One X, a last gen console, having a better output resolution than the Series S. Like, how does that make any sense at all? Right? It doesn't make any sense, and their justification for doing it is that persons still game on 1080p sets, and they don't need the highest resolution, and yada yada yada. They're probably comparing it to something like the smartphone market, where you have higher tier model phones and mid tier phones, but the console market, in my opinion, should never ever be compared to something like smartphone market. And why is that? We get a new console every 5 to like 7 years, whereas you get a new phone every single year. There's a new phone. So your mid-tier phone, right, after 3 years is the same as the premium phone that launched like 3 years prior. Whereas when you buy this mid-tier or this low-tier new Xbox, you are stuck with it for like 7 fucking years. You're playing, and you're sure, it's not sure, but it's highly likely that you will have upgraded your set, right, within that 7 year span. And this is very important. If you're a gamer, you are buying a next gen machine, right? Unless you're a child and it's your parents that are purchasing it for you, you are going to want to eventually upgrade. I don't see someone buying a next gen console and sticking with a 1080p set for like a decade or close to a decade, right? So you'll buy this piece of crap, and then even just 3 years down the line, I mean, you'll be disappointed from now if you're like a pixel counter. But 3 years down the line, you'll be like, why are my games playing like absolute trash? And everybody else is having fun. The same thing happened with the Xbox One S because it was just so weak. But it will be significantly worse because the gap between the lowest one is like 4 teraflops and the highest is like PS5 10.2 and Series X 12, right? So it's significant. It's like 3 times as weak. You're having cutbacks in other games where they're just not including ray tracing, because ray tracing, depending on how it's implemented, it takes such a significant hit, right, on the game's performance. So whether you're implementing ray tracing through ray traced shadows or ray traced reflections, you are getting quite the hit to performance, right? So in my opinion, it should have never been made. I don't know why they did it. Yes, the CPU and the GPU are roughly the same. The GPU has way less compute units. So the Series X has, it's about like 54 compute units, and the Series S has 20, right? But not only that, having less compute units isn't such a bad thing, but the compute units on the Series S are clocked low, right? So they're clocked at around 550 gigahertz as opposed to 1.825. And it has like 6 gigs less RAM. And not only that, probably the biggest offender of them all is the hard drive, right? So the hard drive that comes with the Series S is 500 gigs, right? However, you only have access to 300 plus gigs. Call of Duty Warzone alone is over 100 gigs. There are many other games that get over 100 gigs. Some even get close to pushing 200 gigs. So at most, you will have four AAA titles installed at once. Again, that would not be such a bad thing if you had discs, but it is the diskless console, sorry. So your only option of playing games is to download them, and you are limited to such a small small storage space, right? Now, again, people are being severely misled by Microsoft, right? They're saying that, yeah, but they have these expandable drives, you can just plug them in, fine, they work perfectly, which is true, but they're not talking about the price. The price for one of these drives, as it currently stands, is like $200, right? So you're buying a console for $300, but then you are also going to buy the card for $200, which is $500 in total. Why the fuck would you ever buy that console? Why not just buy the Series X, which is $500, which comes much closer to 1 terabyte? So none of it makes any sense, and I'm glad this is being aired out on my very first podcast, because I will come back to this episode 1 and I'll be like, yes, this is late 2020 CE. I told you, refer to this. It's a piece of shit, etc. I could go on for much longer, but I'll just close off on this whole Series S rant by saying that the Series X is a very good machine, right? The Series X. But it runs the risk of being severely held back by the Series S when it comes on to first-party titles. So anything that Microsoft puts out, they will want it to run the best on all consoles. So their approach would be to target the lowest end first, and then perhaps like adding higher resolution textures, tessellation, adaptive tessellation, stuff like that, and then ray tracing, stuff like that afterwards, right? But their main target will be their base machine, and then they'll work their way upwards. So stuff like Halo Infinite, which is probably the only Xbox exclusive that I know of currently, coming down the line. I mean, we're already seeing it being a complete development nightmare because they lost their lead again, I believe, a couple of months ago. So that again will be significantly held back. So you're probably never going to see the full potential of that console, the Series X, if first-party developers for Microsoft target the Series S as a base. And they've stated that they want to continue to develop like cross-platform games and older games for about 2 years into the next-gen period, which I personally think is a bad idea. My opinion, I think that next-gen should be next-gen, and it's better to give persons a significant jump in terms of graphical quality and graphical fidelity, and to have them experience that and be like, shit, this is actually next level. I'm going to buy a couple more of these or whatever. But show them that significant jump, because nobody wants to be playing last gen titles for 2 more years. Why even bother come out with next gen now if that is your opinion? Anyway, so that's my rant on the Series S, which lasted way too long. But let's just shift focus for a bit to the PS5 versus the Series X. So new console wars, new generation. And we're seeing some somewhat surprising results of the PS5 actually outperforming in pretty much every single cross-platform game that has been released. So we're talking about things like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the latest Devil May Cry remaster, well, not remaster, updated version for the new consoles, Dirt 5, and many other games. So channels like Digital Foundry have been going in depth into these like pixel counting and performance metrics. And not only Digital Foundry, but there's another channel that not many people know about that actually goes into way more detail than Digital Foundry. So if you like Digital Foundry right now, check out NX Gamer on YouTube. So that's NX Gamer. Is just as good, if not better, in many cases than Digital Foundry. However, it's just one guy, and he's completely independent, unlike Digital Foundry, which is like a part of Eurogamer. He's just one guy. However, he's extremely thorough, and he gives his perspective based on actually being a programmer in the industry. So again, stop this podcast at whatever time it is. If you're interested in this type of stuff, like how games actually work, programming, analysis like Digital Foundry. He has his own capture cards and frame rate analysis tools. Pause this video, this podcast at any point in time, and go and search for NX Gamer and subscribe to him right now. That being said, he also analyzes, and pretty much the results are on par with Digital Foundry. And it's the same thing, particularly in like the 120 FPS modes. The PS5 is outperforming the Series X. Now, granted, the Series X does outperform PS5 in very small areas. So like in the quality mode, I believe, on the Devil May Cry 60 frames per second mode. So there are some parts where it actually performs better than the PS5. But overall, even in that game, the PS5 comes out the overall winner, right? Now, the Series X is supposed to be a 12 teraflop beast. It's supposed to be the best and most powerful console ever put out there, right? Ever developed. But even though it has, a GPU with more compute units, like 54 as opposed to Sony's 36, the CUs on the PS5 are clocked significantly higher at 2.23 gigahertz than the Series X. So there is a very significant difference. There's a huge difference between the clock speeds of the Series X and the PS5, right? And the PS5 is also huge, right? And it's built for cooling and for airflow, right? So you should not be having as much like throttling. So you're getting a lot. It's very rare that you should be going below the target clock speed, right? The Series X is also cooled pretty well. Both machines have been tested and they're silent. They don't overheat, provided you put them in the proper place, not closed up in some box or anything like that. So even though it has like 2 teraflops more, or almost 2 teraflops more, the Series X, we're looking at significantly higher clock speeds, right? So that could be one of the reasons that we're seeing these performance differentials. There's also talk in the industry of developers getting dev kits earlier for the PS5. So they're, at this point in time, more familiar with developing on the console. And there's word that it's also easier to develop on the PS5 as opposed to the Series X. Now, some persons have been saying, wait for patches. But ironically, just last week, Valhalla got a patch which improved the performance on the Series X, right? So it's much more in line with PS5 now. However, to achieve that, they literally just lowered like the lower bound of the adaptive 4K, right? So it doesn't run at a native 4K in the 60 FPS mode on either console. So it fluctuates from like 1800p or 1440p up to 4K. So what they did on Series X is just lower that lower bound from 1440p to sub 1440p. So currently, Valhalla on next-gen consoles, it runs pretty much identical, right? However, the PS5 actually still wins because it looks better. So in cases where they both dip resolution, the Series X is dipping more, right? So you have a more consistent image on PS5 and sharper textures overall. And that's with the latest patch. I'm sure there will be more patches because Series X still has this camera bug where there's camera judder. And that has nothing at all to do with frame rate. I don't know. Only the developers would know. They probably don't even know, else it would have been patched by now. But that's the only other quirk to that game. But overall, the PS5 is still outperforming. Now, I don't know if the faster SSD, it shouldn't have anything to do with these games because they're not necessarily developed like with the SSD in mind in terms of like quick travel or using a part of it to like render far distant objects. So the SSD, in my opinion, isn't playing a factor in these performance differentials. It's probably just a higher clock speed and a combination of developers finding it easier to work on this new hardware, right? Now, that being said, I'm excited for both consoles. I just think Microsoft made some bad decisions, and Microsoft overall has always had a lack of first-party titles. So that is, in my honest opinion, why I've always preferred like how Sony handles things. But the Series X is still really promising. I'm looking forward. I really hope that they can actually fix Halo Infinite and that we can get something that looks truly next-gen and plays truly next-gen. Because I was a really big fan of Halo back in like the Halo 2 and Halo 3 days. Afterwards, it just started going all over the place and I couldn't really keep up with the consistency. What else am I looking for? For PS5, I'm definitely looking forward to the new Ratchet and Clank game. I think that looks amazing. It looks CGI. It's the most next-gen looking game that I've seen advertised because it isn't out yet. But I think that so far in the race, in these console wars, PS5 is definitely leading. Barring performance aside, in terms of cross-platform games and cross-gen games, PS5 actually has exclusives, right? So the Demon Soul remake, that's entirely next-gen on PS5. There's Miles, which you can get on PS4, but it's significantly better on PS5. Just those ray trace reflections alone and the 60 FPS mode, like whatever your preference, you get it there. We have like the Little Big Planet just came out, and there are other indie titles like Bug Snacks and stuff like that are really showing the diversity that PS5 has to offer, and it just shows that they were a bit better prepared than the Series X. Now, Series X, I know they had different plans. So Halo was supposed to be either a launch title or around launch. Now, COVID-19 might have impacted developers in a various amount of ways, so we can't really comment on that. But based on what is here presented to us, Sony is definitely head and shoulders right now above Microsoft. Right? Now, another thing that I hear people bring up sometimes is that performance differentials shouldn't really mean much on Series X because it supports, right out the box, it supports VRR, and there's like what 0.1% of persons in the entire world who have VRR sets. So I mean, you should not be developing your game based on the fact that it will be sorted out with VRR, right? That's silly. And persons who comment on that, I'm pretty sure they either don't have a VRR set or they just hear this fancy term being thrown around and say, VRR will fix it. It's a bad habit to develop like that, and I'm hoping that's not how they're approaching development on the Microsoft consoles, right? I'm also really excited for Horizon Forbidden West, though I did hear that it's also coming out on PS4, which is a bit of a disappointment. My opinion, next gen should be next gen, no limiters or anything like that. But we'll see. It did look good, provided that stuff that was actually shown was gameplay, right? So let's move on quickly to preparing for next gen. How are we preparing for next gen now? Like buying new TVs, what's the best deals on TVs? Black Friday was just last week, so I hope you went out and got like some new TVs. I personally got one, a nice 4K HDR. But let's just use segue. 4K HDR, that's the perfect segue into what needs to be done to accommodate next gen, right? You need a 4K TV with HDR. You don't need HDMI 2.1. Again, you'd have to buy a TV that's manufactured in 2020 because like 32 of the 40 TVs that are HDMI 2.1 compatible have been manufactured this year. So anything prior to that, you could have bought a new TV last year and it would pretty much be obsolete regarding HDMI 2.1. So I would not worry about HDMI 2.1 at all, as long as your TV is 4K, HDR, and relatively large for the best viewing and audio experience in some of these TVs. I think that's fine. You can get there are a bunch of steals out right now. Even though Black Friday has gone, we're still in the Christmas season, so definitely cop 4K HDR TV, and that should be it. Buy whatever console you prefer, not the Series S. That's trash. Do not buy the Series S. Wait and save if you currently don't have a next-gen console, right? And that's it for that. What am I playing now to take advantage of the new TV? I've just started replaying a lot of games that came out in HDR, that supported HDR. So I'm back now playing, I'm always playing Warzone. And my gamer tag is Kaif Pape. It's the same as the YouTube channel name, right? So I'm always on Warzone. That supports HDR. I'm going back to God of War. I never did finish it. It's one of the first games I've ever pre-ordered, and I actually didn't finish it. The game was really good, but I just didn't like the shift in focus from just it being a straight action game, something closer to like Devil May Cry originally, to like this whole story-driven, over-the-shoulder camera, slower pace. You can't jump in the game, which is infuriating to me. I believe you should be able to jump in video games, right? But anyway, I'm back playing that. The HDR is done so well in that game. I'm playing it more for just the visual splendor and admiring like the HDR implementation and the graphical fidelity. And it was a really good looking game, and it still is. So that's another good game that I'm playing. I started back Path of Exile again. I mean, I'm going to have a discussion, a podcast entirely dedicated to Path of Exile in the coming weeks. It's actually performing better than how it used to crash like nonstop back, which is part of the reason why I had to stop playing it. It's playing better. It's nothing in 4K or HDR and nothing like that, but it actually looks much better on a larger set than I actually imagined, because it's not the prettiest game in the world. It looks okay, but there are actually no jaggies or anything like that when scaled up to 4K. So that was a pleasant surprise. So the only other thing that I'm probably interested in is Miles, and I'll pick that up in the coming weeks. The reviews, or I usually wait on reviews to come out, and not just industry reviews, but persons actually playing the game, and for user reviews. And I've heard that it's pretty good. The graphics look amazing, so I'm definitely planning on copying that in the upcoming weeks. I'm also really looking forward to the Season 7 of Warzone and what that brings, like the whole Cold War integration. And that's it. So thanks guys. Thanks for listening to me ramble about next gen for over half an hour. Next week, well, I won't tell you guys the topic for next week just yet. I mean, we may have a guest on next week, but that's it. Enjoy the rest of your week. Keep playing games. Keep having fun. Do not buy a Series S, but enjoy whatever platform you're currently playing on. Even if you're into mobile gaming, whatever brings you happiness. And to be honest, if a Series S is all you can afford right now, and you're like in the foreseeable future never planning to upgrade to a 4K set, then do whatever makes you happy. And I mean that genuinely, not like in a sarcastic manner. So yeah, keep playing games, keep having fun, and check back next week for episode 2. Cheers.